The assembly line never stopped. Not for air raid alerts, not for satellite passes, not for the encrypted warnings that landed, ignored, in Russian security service inboxes 3 weeks before the strike. The Alabuga Special Economic Zone in the Republic of Tatarstan ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, because the war demanded it. Russian missiles were falling on Ukrainian cities every night. Those missiles needed replenishment, and the replenishment came from here. From a fortified industrial campus more than 1,200 kilometers from the nearest front line, deep inside Russian territory, insulated from the war it was feeding. That insulation was the point. Moscow had spent 2 years building the narrative that Alabuga was untouchable. That distance alone was a defense. That no Ukrainian weapon could reach Tatarstan, and even if it could, it would never find the right building among the dozens of structures spread across the zone's industrial footprint. The complex had decoy structures, layered radar coverage, mobile air defense systems repositioned on rotating schedules to prevent pattern analysis. Russian state media had even broadcast segments from inside the facility, carefully curated footage designed to project confidence, to tell Tehran the partnership was secure and the production line was safe. But confidence is not the same as security. And the Kremlin's argument rested on one assumption that Ukrainian military intelligence had been quietly, methodically dismantling for months, that Russia still controlled what was known about Alabuga from the inside. It did not. I'm your host at ConflictEast, where we analyze the battles that change wars. What you're about to hear is the story of a precision strike package that traveled over 1,200 kilometers to reach a target Russian counterintelligence called unreachable, and how a single operation against an industrial facility deep inside Russian territory collapsed the logic of strategic sanctuary that Moscow had been selling to its allies since the earliest days of the full-scale invasion. This is Alabuga, and this is how Ukraine burned it down. To understand what made this strike possible, you need to understand what Alabuga actually was. Not the public version, not the sanitized press releases about investment zones and economic development. The real version. The one that Western intelligence agencies had been building dossiers on since the Shahed-136 first appeared over Ukrainian territory, and analysts began tracing the supply chain backward from impact craters to production facilities. The Alabuga Special Economic Zone occupies a substantial tract of land in Tatarstan, a semi-autonomous republic roughly 900 kilometers east of Moscow. The zone was officially established to attract foreign manufacturing investment, and for years it functioned more or less as advertised. A collection of light industrial facilities producing automotive components, chemicals, and consumer goods. The Russian government marketed it aggressively as a model of post-Soviet economic modernization. Then the war came, and the priorities changed. The conversion of Alabuga into a defense production hub happened fast. Iranian technical delegations arrived in the months following the early battlefield setbacks, when it became clear that Russia's stockpile of precision munitions was being depleted faster than domestic production could replace it. The Shahed-136, a one-way attack drone with a distinctive delta-wing profile, a piston engine that produced a buzzing sound Ukrainian civilians learned to dread, and a warhead capable of devastating residential buildings, power substations, and critical infrastructure, became the centerpiece of a new partnership between Moscow and Tehran. Iran had already demonstrated the Shahed's effectiveness. Ukraine had been suffering under Shahed swarm attacks for months by the time Alabuga's conversion was complete. The drones were cheap. Individual unit costs estimated somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000, a fraction of cruise missile prices, and they could be produced in volume. Russia needed volume. The agreement with Iran provided it. Which weapon delivers more psychological damage to civilian populations? The Shahed swarm or the ballistic missile? Which approach has defined Russian strategy against Ukrainian infrastructure? Volume saturation or precision terror? Comment below with your analysis. The production arrangement was layered. Iranian technicians provided design specifications and initial training. Russian engineers adapted the manufacturing processes for domestic supply chains. The final assembly hall at Alabuga, a specific building within the larger complex, separated from the decoy structures and support facilities by roughly 400 meters, became the convergence point where component streams arrived from multiple supplier facilities and left as operational weapons ready for deployment. Ukrainian General Staff reports, corroborated by OSINT investigations using commercial satellite imagery, had been tracking the expansion of Alabuga's production footprint for well over a year before the strike. The key challenge was not identifying that production was happening at Alabuga. That had been established. The challenge was identifying which specific structure housed final assembly operations, at what production tempo, and when the facility would contain the maximum concentration of irreplaceable equipment and completed inventory. That intelligence problem was solved through a combination of signals interception, human intelligence assets operating inside the zone, and painstaking analysis of logistical patterns visible from satellite imagery, truck movements, rail schedules, the timing of what appeared to be quality control processes based on activity patterns outside the assembly hall, the orientation of vehicles during loading operations that indicated which direction finished products were being shipped out. Stay with me, because what the intelligence team discovered about Alabuga's internal security complacency is what made the strike not just possible, but surgically precise. The Russian counterintelligence apparatus responsible for Alabuga's security made a fundamental error. Confident that geographic distance provided protection, it relaxed the communications discipline that would have made signals interception harder. Personnel used personal devices in proximity to the facility. Logistical coordination happened through channels that, while encrypted at the message level, still revealed metadata about timing and routing that trained analysts could exploit. The facility's air defense radar signatures, collected over months of patient observation, had been mapped with enough precision to identify rotation schedules and coverage gaps. None of this happened quickly. Ukrainian military intelligence had been building the Alabuga picture for the better part of a year before any strike was authorized. The targeting package, specific coordinates for the final assembly hall, optimal approach corridors that minimized exposure to radar coverage, the window when the facility would be operating at full production tempo, was refined through dozens of planning iterations. The strike planners confronted a significant obstacle early in mission development. The approach routes from Ukrainian-controlled territory to Tatarstan crossed thousands of kilometers of Russian airspace, passing through regions with overlapping radar coverage from multiple ground-based systems. Initial route planning attempted to thread between radar coverage zones using terrain masking and low-altitude flight profiles, but early simulations suggested that Russian air defense systems along the most direct corridors would detect the incoming strike package with enough lead time to generate an intercept. The solution was not to find a single perfect corridor. It was to use multiple simultaneous approach vectors, arriving from different compass headings at staggered intervals calculated to saturate the tracking capacity of air defense systems in the target zone. Not a single stream of drones following a predictable path, but a distributed package that forced ground-based radar operators to process multiple tracks simultaneously, prioritize among them, and inevitably fail to address all of them before impact. That approach, distributed vectors, staggered timing, coordinated arrival at target, is the signature of serious military planning. It did not come from improvisation. It came from doctrine that Ukraine had been developing and refining through its long-range strike operations over preceding years, each mission adding lessons that fed into the next. Ukraine doesn't just use weapons. Ukraine invents new ways to fight. The drones used in the Alabuga strike were not the commercial quadcopters synonymous with frontline FPV operations. Those weapons, devastating against armor at short range, costing $500 against tanks worth $3 million, were the tactical layer of Ukraine's drone warfare program. The strategic layer was different in almost every way. Ukrainian strike drones in the long-range category are products of a domestic development program that accelerated dramatically as the war progressed. Starting from a defense industrial base that, at the start of the full-scale invasion, had limited capacity for producing complex unmanned systems, Ukrainian engineers and defense contractors built a capability that surprised even optimistic observers. The strike drones used against deep targets inside Russia are typically subsonic, flying at low altitudes to minimize radar cross-section, equipped with navigation systems that combine GPS with inertial guidance and terrain reference navigation to maintain accuracy even in GPS-contested environments. Satellite imagery analysis confirmed the specific targeting in the Alabuga case. The strike hit the final assembly hall rather than the perimeter structures, the storage buildings, or the administrative facilities visible from overhead. That level of precision, hitting the right building inside a complex containing dozens of structures, required the kind of interior intelligence that Russian counterintelligence had assessed as impossible to develop without detection. The assessment was wrong. Combat footage verification from aftermath imagery showed the characteristic blast pattern of multiple warhead impacts on the assembly hall roof and walls. The structure. A purpose-built industrial building with a reinforced concrete frame, substantially more robust than the temporary structures sometimes seen in Russian field operations, sustained damage to the main production floor and the adjacent inventory staging area where completed Shahed units were prepared for shipment to operational theaters. How many Shahed drones was Alabuga producing monthly at peak capacity, according to Ukrainian military intelligence estimates? A 150 units, B300 units, C500 units? The answer is coming at the end of this video. Stay with it. The air defense picture over Tatarstan in the hours before the strike illustrated the gap between deployed capability and effective coverage. Russia had positioned mobile air defense assets in the region. Systems from the Pantsir S family, supplemented by radar installations contributing to the broader Russian air defense network. But the coverage was optimized for a threat profile that assumed incoming aircraft or missiles flying at altitude. The low-altitude, terrain-following profile of Ukrainian strike drones exploited the geometric limitations of radar systems designed for higher threat angle engagement. Russian air defense radar operators in the Alabuga region did detect contacts in the hours before impact. Intercepted communications, analyzed by Ukrainian signals intelligence, and subsequently corroborated by independent OSINT investigators who collected radio traffic from the period, show that at least 3 separate radar tracks were reported to Regional Air Defense Command before the strike. The command response. Delayed by the very saturation problem the strike planners had designed the approach package to create, failed to generate effective intercepts on the tracks that reached the target. One Pantsir S system in the region fired. The engagement log, pieced together from intercepted communications and physical evidence collected by OSINT investigators, suggests it successfully engaged and destroyed one inbound track. One drone from the strike package was intercepted. The rest were not. Subscribe to ConflictEast if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happened next in the Alabuga target complex illustrates everything about the difference between production capacity and production resilience. The strike package impacted in a compressed time window. Multiple warheads arriving within roughly 4 minutes, calculated to prevent facility personnel from implementing any kind of emergency response between the first impact and subsequent ones. Ukrainian General Staff reports describe the targeting sequence as designed to hit the assembly hall's structural integrity in the first impact sequence and the inventory staging area in the second, maximizing disruption to both production capacity and the finished product stockpile. The first impact struck the assembly hall's northern face, where structural analysis derived from overhead imagery had identified the primary production equipment cluster. The high-explosive warheads carried by Ukrainian long-range strike drones are optimized for structural effect, penetrating roof sections before detonating inside the protected space, channeling blast pressure into the enclosed volume where manufacturing equipment would be most vulnerable. What followed? The sequence of secondary explosions as ordnance stored in the staging area cooked off, the structural collapse of compromised roof sections, the fire that OSINT investigators would document in satellite imagery, showing a distinctive thermal bloom over the Alabuga facility, was not part of the primary strike design. It was consequence. The drones delivered the initial energy. The stored Shahed inventory delivered the rest. Ukrainian sources estimate the Alabuga assembly hall fire burned for several hours before Russian emergency services, operating under communications security restrictions that slowed their coordination, brought it under control. By the time the fire was contained, the damage assessment was already being compiled by multiple intelligence organizations tracking the facility. The production floor of the final assembly hall was assessed as non-operational. The inventory of completed Shahed units staged for delivery, reports suggest several dozen finished weapons, was destroyed in the secondary explosions and fire. The precision manufacturing equipment installed under Iranian technical supervision, some of it sourced through Chinese dual-use technology channels that had been a subject of Western sanctions concern, was either destroyed outright or rendered inoperable by fire and blast damage. If you believe tactics win wars, type ConflictEast in the comments. The Russian response to the Alabuga strike played out across several layers simultaneously, and the gaps between those layers revealed as much as the strike itself. At the official level, there was initial silence, the kind of silence that Russian state media defaults to when events contradict the approved narrative of the war. When acknowledgement eventually came, it was partial. A Russian Ministry of Defense statement that described an attempted Ukrainian terrorist attack on civilian infrastructure in Tatarstan claimed that most of the drones had been intercepted and emphasized the distance from the front line as evidence of Ukrainian desperation rather than capability. That framing failed on contact with reality. The damage was visible in satellite imagery within hours of the strike. OSINT investigators had the first thermal imagery showing the fire before Russian state media had issued any statement at all. The gap between the official claim of successful interception and the photographic evidence of a burning assembly hall was not subtle. Iranian reaction to the Alabuga strike was delivered through diplomatic back channels rather than public statements, but the substance was captured in intercepted communications and subsequently reported by multiple Western intelligence services. Tehran's response combined anger at what it characterized as Russian security failures that had exposed a facility operating under Iranian technical partnership, and concern about the intelligence penetration implied by the precision targeting of the assembly hall specifically. The question Iranian officials were asking was not whether Ukraine had struck Alabuga, The question was how Ukraine knew which building to strike. That question, the intelligence penetration question, generated the most sustained internal response from Russian security services in the weeks following the strike. Federal Security Service investigators arrived at the facility. Personnel were interviewed. Communications records were audited. The investigation, according to sources cited in Ukrainian and Western reporting, found evidence of exactly the security complacency that allowed the intelligence picture to be built. Personal device use, logistics coordination through insufficiently protected channels, and the failure to treat geographic distance as a justification for reduced operational security. Russia had told itself that Tatarstan was safe because it was far. Ukraine proved that distance without security discipline is not sanctuary. What would NATO have done differently if tasked with striking the Alabuga facility? Comment your analysis. Specifically, would the approach have differed in timing, weapon selection, or the intelligence preparation phase? The strategic implications of the Alabuga strike radiated outward from Tatarstan in multiple directions. The most immediate was the disruption of Shahed production capacity, Ukrainian General Staff estimates. And these were estimates based on intelligence assessments that carried inherent uncertainty, placed Alabuga's monthly output at the time of the strike at somewhere between 200 and 400 completed units, depending on production tempo in the weeks preceding the operation. The loss of the assembly hall, even temporarily, represented a reduction in output that would be felt in Russian operational planning within weeks. The Shahed had been a critical component of Russian mass attack packages, the low-cost attrition weapon that forced Ukrainian air defense crews to expend interceptor missiles worth many times the drone's production cost, gradually degrading the inventory of interceptors faster than Western supply chains could replenish them. A reduction in Shahed production, even a temporary one, altered that equation. But the production disruption was arguably less significant than the psychological and strategic impact. Alabuga was supposed to be proof that Russia retained strategic depth, that there were facilities, partnerships, production nodes that Ukraine could not reach, could not threaten, could not factor into Russian strategic planning as vulnerable. The strike destroyed that proof. Every Russian general officer, every Iranian technical advisor, every North Korean procurement official who had placed confidence in the theory that physical distance from the front was reliable protection now had to revise their threat model. If Ukraine could reach Alabuga, what else could it reach? The Shahed production node was one answer to that question. But the question itself, the expansion of the vulnerability map in Russian strategic thinking, was the deeper consequence. Ukrainian drone operators, interviewed in the after-action coverage that Ukrainian defense media published in the days following the Alabuga strike, described the mission in terms that captured both the technical complexity and the human weight of what they had accomplished. The mission had taken months of preparation. The approach required coordinating multiple assets across vast distances with precision timing that left minimal margin for error. The drone operators who monitored the strike package's progress did so knowing that a single navigation failure, a single unexpected radar activation, a single intercept they hadn't accounted for, could abort months of work. The technical obstacle that required the most creative problem-solving was not the approach routing or the target identification. It was navigation integrity across the full 1,200-plus kilometer flight. Ukrainian long-range strike drones operate in an environment where Russian electronic warfare systems have progressively improved their ability to interfere with GPS signals. The navigation solution used for the Alabuga strike combined multiple redundant systems. GPS were available, inertial navigation to maintain course through GPS-denied corridors, and terrain reference navigation in the terminal phase that allowed the weapons to confirm their position against the mapped terrain profile of the target area even without GPS signal. That terrain reference navigation, matching the sensor return of the terrain below the drone against a preloaded terrain database, is what allowed the strike package to maintain targeting accuracy through a GPS jamming environment that should, by Russian doctrine, have rendered the incoming weapons blind. It did not render them blind. It forced the navigation solution to shift from GPS to a backup mode the jamming was not effective against. The jamming failed. The drones arrived. The assembly hall burned. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. ConflictEast. The aftermath analysis, assembled from satellite imagery, intercepted communications, Ukrainian military intelligence summaries, and the subsequent reporting of Western defense analysts, converged on a consistent picture of what the Alabuga strike had achieved and what it had cost. On the achievement side, a production facility assessed as responsible for a significant fraction of Russia's Shahed assembly capacity had been put out of operation. The production hiatus would require repair work, equipment replacement, and a security review that would itself slow the resumption of operations. The completed inventory staged for delivery was destroyed. The Iranian partnership had been complicated by a security failure that both parties would spend months trying to assign responsibility for. Ukrainian losses in the strike package were limited to the single drone confirmed intercepted by the Pantsir S system in the Tatarstan air defense network. Every other asset in the strike package reached its assigned release or impact point. The scale of intelligence preparation required: months of source development, satellite imagery analysis, signals intelligence exploitation, route planning, and simulations, meant the Alabuga strike was not the product of a sudden decision. It was the result of a sustained intelligence effort running in parallel with every other aspect of Ukraine's military campaign. The coordination between Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, the Security Service of Ukraine, and the defense industrial entities responsible for producing the strike assets represented a level of interagency integration that, at the start of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine's military establishment had not yet developed. The war built that integration. Necessity, compressed timelines, and the understanding that survival itself depended on developing capabilities that did not exist built it faster than any peacetime program could have. Now, the answer to the quiz from earlier in this video. How many Shahed drones was Alabuga producing monthly at peak capacity? The correct answer is B, approximately 300 units per month at assessed peak production tempo, though estimates ranged between 150 and 500 depending on the intelligence source and the time period assessed. Ukrainian military intelligence, working from the combination of signals, exploitation, and human intelligence that enabled the strike targeting, placed the figure at approximately 300 units monthly in the period immediately preceding the strike. That production rate represented roughly 1/3 of Russia's total estimated Shahed assembly capacity across all facilities, making Alabuga the single largest node in the production network, and the highest value target for disruption. The lessons of the Alabuga operation are ones that military planners across multiple nations are absorbing into their doctrine and force planning. The first is that production facilities, no matter how geographically distant from active fronts, are valid and valuable targets in modern industrial warfare, and that the technology to reach them is increasingly available to non-superpower militaries. Ukraine demonstrated a range of over 1,200 kilometers with precision sufficient to hit a specific building inside a multi-structure industrial complex. That capability sets a precedent. The second lesson is that production security is not separable from operational security. The Alabuga strike was enabled as much by Russian security complacency as by Ukrainian intelligence capability. The geographic isolation that Russia believed made the facility safe had produced a security culture that failed to discipline communications, failed to enforce operational security protocols, and failed to treat insider threat as a serious risk. The result was an intelligence penetration that allowed targeting precision that would otherwise have been impossible. The third lesson is about the cost exchange equation that drone warfare introduces at the strategic level. The Ukrainian strike drones used against Alabuga were expensive by FPV standards, but orders of magnitude cheaper than the production equipment, completed inventory, and partnership credibility they destroyed. Modern warfare consistently punishes the assumption that expensive, purpose-built defenses will hold against cheaper, more innovative offense. Ukraine has proven this at every level of the conflict. From $500 FPV drones defeating $3 million tanks at the front line to long-range strike packages disrupting billion-dollar production relationships deep inside Russian territory. The fourth lesson is about intelligence investment. The Alabuga strike required months of preparation for minutes of execution. The preparatory period. The intelligence collection, source development, route analysis, production tempo monitoring was the harder and more important work. Military organizations that invest in intelligence collection, analysis, and integration into operational planning get access to strikes like Alabuga. Those that treat intelligence as secondary to kinetic capability do not. Was the decision to strike Alabuga, rather than focusing strike resources on closer, more immediately tactical targets, the right strategic choice? Could Russian counterintelligence have protected the facility with better operational security discipline? And if you had been the Ukrainian operational planner reviewing the target package for this mission, what would you have done differently? Before you decide, consider this. Targeting industrial production as a component of a wider campaign is not improvisation. It is doctrine. And every successful strike against Russian production capacity at depth makes the next strike easier to justify, easier to plan, and easier to execute. Will Ukraine strike Alabuga again? Or has the facility already been moved or hardened? Comment yes or no. And if you have an analysis of what the next phase of deep strike targeting might look like, we read every comment on ConflictEast. Subscribe to ConflictEast, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The Alabuga Special Economic Zone is quieter now than it was before the strike. The assembly hall that burned is being rebuilt. Russian authorities announced reconstruction plans within weeks of the operation because the production partnership with Iran is too valuable to abandon, and the alternative of purchasing completed Shahed units directly from Iran at higher cost is less attractive than domestic production. But the reconstruction takes time. The replacement equipment takes time. The security review, the personnel changes, the hardening of communications and access protocols. All of it takes time. And in this war, time is not neutral. Every month of reduced Shahed production is a month of fewer swarm attacks on Ukrainian cities, fewer interceptors expended, fewer Ukrainian air defense crews running the exhausting calculation of how many missiles to commit against an incoming track, fewer Ukrainian civilians waking to the distinctive buzzing engine sound that has become the auditory signature of Russian mass attack. The wrecks of the assembly hall remain, beneath whatever reconstruction has been layered over them. Silent reminders that 1,200 kilometers is not sanctuary, that industrial production is a target, that modern warfare punishes the assumption of safety without verification, and that Ukraine, fighting for its existence against an adversary with more resources and more depth, has learned to reach further, strike more precisely, and plan more patiently than anyone in Moscow predicted it could. Real tactics, real consequences. Conflict East.